bit of how NASA is organized, and we're going to talk about some of their structure things that impact proposal solicitations that they send out, some of the different types of solicitations that they do, and some component things of more of the common proposals, because there are some differences on requirements that they have for things that they want in their submissions versus NSF or NIH. And then we'll talk about the system that they commonly use, which is called Inspires. We'll just touch on that a little bit and where you can go to get more information on how to use it. And then we'll talk about some things that happen in post-award that sometimes are a little bit different for the NASA proposals. So to begin with, NASA is a federal organization that is operates under a congressional charter. And they are supposed to look at knowledge of the Earth, the atmosphere, and the space. So those are the three main areas that they do research in. They have an operational and utilized strategic plan. And the utilization part is very important. You'll see a lot of organizations will have a strategic plan that's posted, and it was like posted a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years ago. Nobody's looked at it since. It's not that way for NASA. NASA funds a lot of their stuff based on the current updates that they put out on their strategic plan. So if you're a researcher or you have a researcher that's working on stuff, they may want to go and look and see in the areas where they would normally do funding and see what the strategic plan has in that particular area. Their administrator is Jim Bridestone. He's appointed by Congress, and so is the deputy administrator. The NASA is a very large organization. If you've ever looked at a map depiction of all the different centers and sites that they have quite a few. I've listed most of them here. The headquarter level offices, education, safety, health, medical, and small business programs, there's actually more. They will sometimes also put out solicitations that aren't in the regular announcements that go out. So it's good sometimes to know those, especially if you've got research that may touch on topics in those areas. The main announcements that come out come from the directorates. There are 5 main ones. Sometimes education will put out separate announcements, so sometimes they are considered a 6th directorate. They have 18 different centers and facilities, and they're kind of listed there. And we'll talk more about how that plays into solicitations in a few minutes. If you haven't done a NASA or like a DOE proposal before, you may have seen it, you may not have seen it, but there's a term they use a lot called FFRDC, and that's a federally funded research development center, or an FFRL, a federally funded research national lab. They'll have, if those are going to participate with you on a proposal, it'll have an impact on your budget because you'll have a total amount for your award, and then you'll have to mention the amount that's going to go to this federal agency if they're allowed to receive funds on the proposal as a separate amount, because they won't send it to OU. They'll send it directly to them. And if you want to see more information about this structure, there's a link that you can go to here. And I checked the links out about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they were all working then. If they don't work from the PowerPoint, take them and cut and paste them into your browser and try that way. So any of the offices, directorates, or centers can specifically solicit a proposal, or they might be involved in the review of a proposal. And they look at proposals differently from a lot of organizations. They have what they call solicited, unsolicited, and response. So for NASA, a solicited proposal is one where they come to you. They have seen something that you've published or some research results somewhere, or they met somebody at a conference or something, and the program officer is reaching out to you to submit a proposal. Sometimes you might be the only one that they reach out to. Sometimes they may reach out to a select group, and that those are the only people that are invited to participate in that funding consideration. So that's what they call a solicited proposal. Then they have what is called an unsolicited proposal, which is where you have a great ideal, you think that they might be interested in funding, and so you want to submit a white paper or something like that. That's an unsolicited. Then a response, that's what they call when you're sending in a proposal that's related to an announcement that has gone out. So if you're talking with the program officer, it's good to know the difference between these as they use them in a conversation with you. You can't submit an unsolicited proposal in something that already has scope or parameters that have been put out in a call or a solicitation. It's a good ideal, especially if you think you might be doing some unsolicited proposals, or if you want a heads up that there might be an announcement coming out, to find the directorates that you might be doing the most funding with and sign up for announcements and newsletters and research feeds that they have coming out. Because sometimes they'll put a heads up and they'll say, oh, by the way, in 30 or 60 days, we're going to be issuing the notice of announcement for this particular type of funding. So that kind of gives you a head start to building your team and doing a little background work before the actual solicitation comes out. Most of the time, the actual solicitations come from one of the directorates that we mentioned before, and we'll get into how that plays into some of the guidance that comes out in a minute. So the Science Mission Directorate, which is one of the largest that puts out solicitations, has 4 research programs. How many of you here have heard of the ROSES guidance? Okay, so the ROSES guidance is the really huge solicitation that comes out, and it has an appendix for each one of these areas. So you have to figure out what area or areas your research fits under, and then read all of the things in that appendix to see which ones interest you and who the program officers are. NASA's budget has a big impact on their funding, and it has happened before that they may give you an award for 3 or 4 years, and they may only fund year by year. And the second or third year of your award, their budget got changed by Congress, and so you lost your funding. So that's good to be aware of going into as you're making your plans. When Congress approves the budget for NASA, they have a tendency to also make some kind of prescribed spending thing that they have to do in the budget. And a lot of times they don't give them extra money to cover it. So for example, if you watch the appropriations information that came out in fiscal year 18, they tagged on a thing that said they had to pursue the Europa Clipper missions, but they didn't give them any extra money based on what they had asked for their budget to do that. So they had to carve funds out of their budget projection to cover the tasking that Congress had gave them to do that mission. NASA has a lot of information on their website related to their budget that says where they're projecting award funding is going to go, where current expenditures are being made. And there's also a couple of really good sites. The first one here, the AIP org appropriation, is really good because it has a lot of pie charts to kind of show you how they're spending their funds or projecting that they be spent. This is helpful for you when you're doing the proposal, because if you know there's not a lot of money going in one area, but you can slant your research to go towards another one, that may put you into a bigger pot of funds. It's very common that when a specific solicitation comes out, that they will have a webinar or some type of a conference call to discuss what it is that they want to see, or if there's particular requirements that they have. They usually also record these and make them available later if you're not able to connect at the time that it's done. The relationship that you have with the program officer is very critical, because program officers at NASA are usually there for life or until they don't want to be there. They get picked because they're the expert in their field, and they have a lot of leeway. Sometimes they can put out a solicitation or have a pocket of money to spend, and they don't have to do a whole call for proposals. They don't have to have a review panel look at stuff. They can make the decision themselves on what's going to be funded. So you don't want to get off on the wrong foot with the program officer at NASA, because it could affect your career and funding for that particular division for the rest of your career, if not the program officers. If you have a multi-organizational team, it's very important that you be clear on how your team is going to operate, how they're going to communicate and share information. They like to see that you do periodic meetings. And a lot of NASA solicitations also allow what they call contingency funds. And for the contingency funds, you don't have to be specific, like we are anticipating that there's going to be X amount of increase in purchasing these types of materials because we had some heads up knowledge from a conference that we attended. All you have to do is say, okay, I'm going to put $20,000 for contingency funding in year 3 because we're anticipating that the cost of inflation is going to have an impact on the parts that we're going to have to buy for this.
If the contingency doesn't happen, what happens to the contingency fund?
That depends on the solicitation that you're responding to. If they have addressed the contingency funds in the solicitation, they'll tell you there what's going to happen with it. A lot of times you won't get the contingency funds. Sometimes they'll let you shift a certain amount into other areas. Sometimes they're very hands-on, and usually those are the ones that have an easier time getting the contingency shifted and used. So they have 4 definitions for opportunities. They have what's called an announcement opportunity, or an AO. They're usually very high cost, unique types of proposals involving experimental things, and they're usually awarded as contracts, although they can do them as a grant. They're usually very hands-on on these, and these are usually very, very high dollar, like multi-million dollars. The GeoCarb proposal that we got came under an AO. Then they have the NASA research announcements. Those are more common. They are just to support different NASA programs and interest. They could result in you being issued a grant, a contract, or a cooperative agreement. The largest NRA is the ROSES. So if you're applying to ROSES, then that'll come in as usually a grant or cooperative agreement. They have what's called a cooperative agreement notices, or CANs. Those are where there's a lot of cooperative work done between NASA and the organization. You have a lot of meetings with them. They'll do site visits. They come and they talk with you about how the funds are going to be spent and the decisions that are being made. You also see these a lot with the big experimental programs too. They do a lot of meetings. They have what's called a NASA announcement, or an AN, which isn't really a solicitation, but I wanted to mention it because it's something that you'll see sometimes posted by the centers or the labs on their websites, because they'll be looking for a person to come and help them work in a lab to work and train with a NASA researcher. And so you put in for one of those, and they'll give you a letter acknowledging that you've been selected to come and visit with them and work for, usually it's 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. The centers and the labs and other areas of NASA, like remember I mentioned the staff offices, like safety, can provide funds to either orgs in a variety of manners, such as fellowships and internships, paying for you to come out to research or to possibly learn how to use a new piece of equipment. Or if you're a leader in your field, maybe they want to pick your brain about something that they've got going on at a particular lab that they think you've got expertise in. These are outside of the opportunities that we talked about earlier. These are separate announcements and things that are put out. You will never hear about these unless you have a relationship with the program officer or you're monitoring what's going on their website, because they don't put them in the regular solicitations. Another thing I wanted to make sure everybody is aware of, that The ROSES is not your basic document for doing the submissions to NASA or for writing a proposal. They have what's called the Handbook for Proposers that's put out yearly, and it's a smaller booklet, and it covers how they want things formatted and general information about things that they want in certain, like their current and pending and bio sketches and things like that. So when you're looking at the ROSES or your specific solicitation, most of the time it'll refer you back to the CAN. Sometimes it won't though. So if it doesn't tell you how to format something, then you need to go back to the CAN and look and see, because it's probably in the CAN. It also has a general checklist that you can use on what is normally required in a NASA proposal. So you can take that checklist and then take your specific solicitation and see what's in addition to or different, and make a good checklist that you can use as you compile your proposal. There's also a lot of links in the CAN. So just having a print version is not going to help you. You want to save an electronic version, because if there's a format that they have put out, like for an abstract that they want used, normally the link will be in the CAN if it's a general spreadsheet or form that's normally used in submissions. So on the ROSES, that normally comes out the last several years annually, but it's as NASA needs it. Years ago, it only came out once every 2 or 3 years, but for the last like 5 or so, it's come out every year. One of the things to be aware of on the ROSES when it comes out is they do a lot of updates and modifications to it over the course of the year. I mean, a lot, like 26, 28, 30 some odd mods. And they don't send anything out that a modification has happened. And you just have to know that you periodically need to go in and look at the ROSES and see if there's mods, and then see if it affects anything in the area where you're doing research. If you've wondered how to get to the strategic plan, there is a link at the beginning of the ROSES that'll take you to the current NASA strategic plan. And it's arranged in the order of the 4 areas that we talked about before. So there's some general information at the very front, and then there's appendixes for each of the areas, like earth sciences, things, heliosciences and stuff. And so if your research is in one of those areas, then you need to go to the appendix for your area of research. If it might overlap between 2, then you want to look at both and see if there's something more appealing in one than it is in the other. Each year when they put a new one out, they'll do a summary of significant changes if there was something major that changed at the very beginning. It's not easy to use. If you've seen it, it's like 600 pages long. It does have links in it. So sometimes you have to have an electronic copy so you can see where the link is directing you to for more information, or sometimes for forms that have to be used in your submission. Sometimes you can submit to programs within your appendix in the ROSES. However, it's more common that a specific solicitation will also be issued in support of items in that appendix. So you may get a solicitation from someone that says, hey, would you like me to be interested in submitting to this particular proposal? And when you look at it, it'll only have like 10 or 15 pages, particularly about the type of research that they're wanting for that solicitation. And then you'll have to tie it back to the appendix in the ROSES that it's tied to, so you can see if there's anything related in the ROSES that's going to impact your submission. It's very common for NASA to do what they call a step 1 and a step 2 proposal, which I'll mention in a minute. And it's also common that you might see a notice of intent, a preliminary, or a white paper be asked for before they even ask you for a proposal, or you may not even get asked for a proposal based on the reviews that you get from the white paper or the preliminary. So if they're asking you for a step 1 is usually a preliminary proposal, kind of like a really short description of the work. Sometimes they'll tell you how many pages, or they'll tell you the content that they want. It's usually somewhere around 3 pages. Sometimes there is a budget number. Sometimes there's not. And if there is a budget number, usually it's just an estimate. The main thing that they're looking for is a description of the science of what you're intending to do and the composition of your team, so they can see what those look like and can decide if they are going to encourage or discourage you. The 2 main ways they look at telling you if they're interested or not in your proposal is what they call invite or not invite. So invite means, yes, go ahead and submit a full proposal on this. Non-invite means we don't want to see a full proposal from you. Please don't, because we're not going to look at it if you submit it. If they do encourage, discourage, encourage means, yes, submit a full proposal. Discourage means we will allow you to submit one, but it may not be in your best interest because something was found to be weak or they didn't like in your proposal. So you either have to do some major rework to try and get beyond what they saw as an issue. And sometimes you'll have comments where you can figure this out. Sometimes you have to depend on being able to talk with the program officer to get an idea of the areas that you're going to work on. So if they give you a discourage, you need to think very seriously about whether you want to take the time to go ahead and submit at that time. It may be better for you to go ahead and kind of do some rig work and wait till the next time the solicitation comes out. It is possible that you can go from a step 1 to a full proposal submission. So it's not always that you're going to have a step 1 and a step 2. The step 2 can be a full proposal. Most normally it is. It can also be just a second step on the way. Maybe they're asking for more information on your science. Maybe they're asking for detailed budget or more information about your team, and they'll come back and they'll ask for a step 3. Step 3 is the final information, whatever it is that they want. Most of the time, if they didn't get a budget in step 2, they want the budget in the step 3. Most commonly, what we see most of the time is they'll do a step 1, which is the white paper type of deal, and then they'll do a step 2, which is the full proposal. Submissions for NASA normally go through grants.gov or Inspires. Most of the time it's Inspires. It'll tell you in the specific solicitation what systems you have the opportunity to use. It also happens every so often. You may be asked to do the whole submission as an email to the program officer. But most normally Inspires is the system that's used. Usually the program officers, especially the NASA Science Mission Directorate, which uses the ROSES, prefers things come in through Inspires. If you've never seen it spelled out before, Inspires stands for NASA Solicitation and Proposal Integrated Review and Evaluation System. If you do decide you want to submit in grants.gov, or you're being told in the solicitation that you must submit in grants.gov, keep in mind that you still have to have an Inspires account and affiliation with OU, because what happens is once the submission goes into grants.gov, grants.gov is then going to dump it into the Inspires system for it to be managed by NASA. In your grants.gov submission, if you have to do grants.gov, or if that's the way you decide you want to go, they have what's called a supplemental data sheet that has information that has to be filled out. They ask for the username of the AOR to be included, and that is not the PI. That is the person over in our offices. So just keep that in mind. A summary form, it's a special zip file that you have to pull down and fill out, and then it has to be uploaded into grants.gov. And then they have a specific data form that's also another zip file that has to be pulled down and loaded and then put back in. The problem that we see sometimes with trying to load some of these zip files and stuff back into grants.gov is it'll cause file corruptions. And so you don't, if you're going in grants.gov with a NASA, you don't want to be doing that at the last minute. You want to allow enough time that you can do the submission and get a report on the error so you can try and resubmit. So in Inspires, which is NASA's submission system, you have to be registered and affiliated with the organization. It requires our office to submit, so that we're the ARO. You have to include someone in our office, like your PDS, as part of your research team, if you want them to be able to see things as you add them into the application. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. You can load items into the application, and when you're ready to have them looked at, then you can transfer them to our office and give us permission that way. All of the team members that you have associated with your proposal have to be uploaded. Their name has to be entered into your application that resides in Inspires. And then once you load them, Inspires will send them an email and ask them to go into the Inspires system and confirm that they know that they're participating on this proposal. So you don't want to have someone who doesn't have a NASA account that you load on here, who's waiting till the last minute to do their affiliations and set up their account, because you cannot submit a proposal if you've got someone who hasn't acknowledged that they know that they're on the proposal. So what happens is, if it gets to the last minute, we have to drop that person out of your team listing. There's a way that we can add them manually, but it won't show that they've agreed to participate in the proposal. So NASA can look at that negatively, that you don't have their participation. There is a really good place that Inspires has. It's called Sarah, and they have all types of little how-to informations on how to do submissions, how to use Inspires, and a lot of, like, some of the components of what's going to go into your proposal. So if you just go to the NASA and you type in Sarah, it'll usually find you, but that link works for the submission information. So in the Inspires setup, they have these little tabs on the left that you can go to. And so in the proposal information tab, that's where the PI is going to load their name, the organization, the title, the dates of the project, and a publicly releasable project summary. And if I recall correctly, I think that's also character count limited. I want to say 4,000. Then the next tab is applicant information. Some of this usually pre-fills as part of pulling that solicitation. It'll put like the directorate's name, possibly the program officer. You would select if it's a resubmission or if there's foreign involvement, and there's some questions that you have to answer. If you have a NASA civil servant that's involved in the proposal with you, normally they're not allowed to receive budget funds. So this is where you would identify that they're involved in the proposal. The submitting organization name, the DUNS number, the cage number, the point of contact. You will pre-fill with the PI who starts the application. You may want to change it to our office. That way we'll be notified if anything goes on related to it. And I mentioned before, this is where the team members are mentioned, and they have to all confirm that they know that they're on the proposal. Then there's a tab called budget, and it has a year-by-year breakdown for your budget. If you don't use all the years of the tab, it normally comes in with 3 or 4, and say your budget's only 2 years, it'll set a warning telling you there's a problem. Don't be concerned if you see that. If you know that you don't need to use those extra years, it just automatically flags it to let you know that there's not data there. Then there's an attachment, there's a program specific data. This is not on all Inspires. It's on most of them, but not on all. And it involves, like, if you want to identify that you're going to be using high-end computing resources, if you've got certain types of field work going on, if you've got students that are involved in the proposal. A lot of that type of information is going to be in the solicitation. It'll remind you, oh, well, you're going to be doing all these astronomical calculations. You may need access to, there's 2 or 3 particular high-end computer resources that NASA has. So you need to put a justification there why you need to use those resources, or that you've already made arrangements with the person who controls that asset for access. Then they have an attachment section. Usually there are 1 to 3 attachments that go in this area. And then when we hit submit, there's a certifications statement that our office signs. So those are kind of the main sections that they look at. It's not uncommon that you will have to provide a budget in 3 different formats for a NASA submission. One of the formats is the tabs that is loaded that I just talked about. And usually our office will help load that for you. We'll take the budget that routes and we'll load that for you. But you also usually have to have what's called a redacted budget and a total budget. And so in the redacted budget, they don't want to see specific salaries and fringe benefits and IDC information. They just want to see things like the percent of effort that someone is working, what you're spending for travel and supplies. They came out with this about 2 or 3 years ago because they felt like review panels were being influenced by finding out that one institution had a higher fringe rate than somebody else, or one institution had a higher IDC rate than somebody else. So they wanted to blind that to the reviewers and only have the parts of the budget that they felt the reviewers needed to consider to determine if the proposal had allowed enough budget to cover the work that was being proposed. So that's called your redacted budget. Most of the time, we will help you do that. We'll take the budget justification that you used for the routing, and we'll help you cut it down to the parts that you need, or to help make a table that just covers the sections that you need for the redacted budget. In the total budget, that's a separate file. Usually either the reviewers don't see it at all, or they only see it when they have made their selections, like we're looking at the final proposals that we're going to fund. The total budget includes everything. It's kind of like, normally what we'll do is we'll take each of the years of the OU spreadsheet that you routed, and we'll PDF those, and we'll add the budget justification to it and the rate agreement to it. If you have subcontracts, we'll do the same thing for all of theirs. It'll have their detailed year-by-year budget, their budget justification, and their rate agreement. So it's everything related to the detail line by line of the categories of spending that you have for that proposal. In most of the NASA submissions, they want what's called a personnel work effort. And one of the things that's unusual about this is there's a note on it that says, even they don't care if it's funded or unfunded work. If it's unfunded work, they promise that they're not going to claim it as cost share. So if you have someone who's working on the proposal for 10% of their time and they're not getting paid in the budget, you would still list them on this personal work effort. They want to see the effort of everyone who's contributing to the proposal. Where it is located sometimes changes based on the solicitation. Usually it's either just before the budget or just after the budget.
When you say working on the proposal and their effort to that, you mean working on the proposed project or working on the composing the text of the grant proposal?
Working on the project.
Thank you.
If the guidance doesn't say where to locate it, then usually we put it after. We put it in the total budget section after the budget pages. They do have limitations on CVs and current and pendings, and they have different lengths that are required. Sometimes they will tell you in the solicitation, what it is that they want to see. As far as length goes, sometimes they'll tell you what they want to see as far as the actual contents. There is a little bit of information in the proposal handbook on the current and pending and the CVs. And one of the things that's interesting about NASA is most of the time, they don't want to see a CV unless you are involved in more than 10% of the proposed effort or budget for that particular proposal. So if you have someone who's only minorly involved, you may not need a CV for them at all. So you've got to be sure and check your guidelines. Another difference that they make sometimes too is sometimes they will allow a 2-page CV for the lead PI, and everybody else only has a 1-page CV that's allowed. So pay really close attention to the solicitation on what it wants for the CVs, because it can vary a lot. On the geocarb submission that we had, the announcement for that only allowed 1 page for the lead PI, and everybody else was only allowed to have half a page. You also have to look at the information that it gives you in the program element part of the solicitation, because it'll tell you what page limits there are for different parts of the proposal. In the roses, in the appendix that covers the area that you're looking for, at the end of each section in that appendix, usually there's what they call a summary of key information. And that sometimes will have a list of the forms and the page limits that they have. And also will have the program officer, the contact if you have particular questions about that. Inspires does have some limited error checking capabilities. Mainly it's just to look for if there's a question that you didn't answer or if there's a file that's missing. So it doesn't do a lot of checking like for formatting or anything like that. That's done after the submission goes in and NASA gets the package. If you have to submit a notice of intent using Inspires, most of the time you will and you get invited to do a full submission, most of the time you have to go back into Inspires and pull the notice of intent that you submitted, and there's a button you can hit on it that will convert your notice of intent into the shell for your full proposal submission. That's how they know that you did the notice of intent and are cleared to do the full proposal submission if the notice of intent was required. I mentioned they have a lot of amendments that come out on the solicitations that they do. So you should check at least 30 days before the submission. They try not to do any within that 30-day prior to the deadline window, but I have seen them do it before. Their due dates that they give are normally 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. I will tell you that that does not affect our deadline here. Our deadline is close of business 5 p.m. local time. If a proposal is late, usually the system will let it go in, but the program officer has the discretion to decide if he's going to accept it or not. And usually it depends on how well you know the program officer and how many other submissions that they got, because if you busted the deadline, then there's a good chance they're not going to accept it, because if you can't meet the deadline, how does that represent how well you're going to meet the requirements for the reports that you're going to have? The data management plan is usually required. It has an 8,000 character entry limit on it, and it's usually contained in the cover page unless the solicitation tells you someplace else to put it in the proposal. Cost share is usually not required. However, if you provide it, they may claim it. So if you want to put anything in on cost share, we recommend that you don't put it in as quantified amounts. Just mention it in general. For example, a graduate student will be working on this item at no cost to the sponsor for this proposal. don't say a graduate student is going to be working on this at X amount of salary for 4 months for this proposal, because once you quantify it, then they can capture it and claim it. NASA will conduct research with foreign entities, but sometimes it's very limited. Sometimes they won't allow budget to go to the foreign entity, or they will limit how much can go. They will usually allow you to conduct research or to travel to a particular place for meetings or to collect information. They will let you have consultants, like foreign consultants and stuff like that. Sometimes the nature of the project that you're working on may be very restricted and they may not want any foreign involvement at all. A lot of their proposals have what's called the China exclusion on it, which means that you can't have any current affiliations with Chinese organizations if you get accepted for an award and you're involved in that proposal. At the time of submission, you could go in with one, but when the award comes in, you would have to drop that affiliation or you wouldn't be allowed to participate in the proposal. It is possible, depending on how the foreign entity might be treated, that we might have a subcontract with them, or we might treat them as a vendor. So NASA kind of allows us to figure out the best way to handle the relationship depending on what work is being done where and how the funds are going to flow. Most normally, if that happens, though, we still handle them internally as a subcontract. So we would still want a budget justification, a letter from their organization saying that they know that they're involved in the proposal and they're going to participate. If it gets awarded, then we would have a document that we sign with them to set up an official agreement. After submission, NASA's goal is to announce that you're going to get an award in 150 days or less after the proposal due date. However, that is very restricted by their budget. So when you hear like there's been a freeze on the budget from Congress and delays on the budget being approved in Congress, that's a direct impact on when they can announce awards, because they may not know what funding they're going to get. Once they notify you that you've been selected for award, they like it to be able to start within 45 to 50 days after that notice comes in. So things have to move pretty quickly. If you want some more information on some of the criteria and things that the normal review panels look for, there are, like, I want to say 3 to 5 pages in the NASA handbook for proposals that talks about some of the things that they look at. It is possible, once you put the proposal in, even during when it's going through review, that you might get contact, like an email from the program officer asking for you to answer a question or provide more information. Sometimes you'll get those prior to the review process too. If you get one as part of the review, they will usually give you less than 3 to 5 days to respond. So once you've put in your proposal to NASA, you want to kind of keep an eye on your email to see if you get any of this traffic. Because if you don't respond, they assume you don't care, and they will either let the proposal go through with the missing the information that they thought you should have provided, or they won't let it go through for review. Some solicitations mention that as either a step in the review process or a step in the award, you will have a site visit. If you get selected for a site visit, sometimes they want to see all of the people that are participating in your team. Sometimes they may go and visit them at their location. Sometimes they may come to and want to visit them all in our location. It's also not uncommon for them to do several conference calls and meetings, not only with you as the person who's getting the award, but with your whole team. NASA sends notices to the contact person who was listed in the Inspires. Most of the time, these notices just tell you that there's an update to your proposal. They don't tell you anything about what's going on. So you have to log into the system and look to see if you can figure out what it is they're trying to tell you. If you get a notice from NASA and you can't tell for sure if ORS is on it or not, contact someone in our office, your PDS or your SPC or me, because sometimes they send the notice to the PI and they don't send anything to us at all. And we don't find out until several weeks down the road that they're in the process of considering you for an award. So we could be going ahead and doing some initial setup things on our end if we knew that that was taking place. Usually you get 15 days from the time that they send you the official award notice to when they want it back. That's a pretty quick turn time, especially if you've got a big team. Most normally on the very, very large proposals like the GeoCard proposal that we had, they'll allow more time because they're actually heavily involved in a lot of final budget decisions and things like that. When you get the award notice, make sure you check and see what the reporting requirements are, because that can vary a lot by the program officer. They may want reports every 90 days, every 6 months, by milestones, or by at the end of the year. So be sure and check that closely. They also have a separate manual for nothing but managing the grant and award information. So that's called the Grants and Cooperative Agreements Manual. And it's another book that's about that big. I mentioned before any personnel restrictions that you had. So like if you had someone who had a current affiliation with China and the award comes in, that has to be resolved, and statements have to be signed certifying that all those issues have been resolved. I mentioned before the reports. Usually from NASA, the award vehicle is not a contract. It's usually a cooperative agreement or a grant or a fellowship. They're usually very heavily involved in the work that they have going on. Like you'll be working with the program officer very closely or with the team that they have there. And we have seen a lot of the contacts are usually very agreeable to working with you and trying to help resolve issues and problems. They do allow no-cost extensions, but don't consider that they're automatic and they're just going to happen because you ask for them. They're going to want you to justify why you need one, why your burn rate for spending your funds wasn't managed better. And if you think you're going to need one, you should talk to them early to discuss it. They very strongly enforce what's called the Fly America, Buy America Act. So if you're going to be traveling overseas, you want to make sure that you're flying on American aircraft carriers if it's at all possible. If you're going to be buying parts and equipment, you want to make sure that it's from American sources. And if not, you want to make sure that you get the permission from the grants people at NASA that that purchase is okay. They're very seriously about timely reports, and they will stop your spending and pull your funds in a heartbeat if you blow off your report deadlines. There are quite a few FAQs available at this website. Some of them are related to small business activities, but there are a lot of general ones that are good to look at too. So we mentioned earlier the AO announcements are for those high risk type of and experimental type of projects. They're usually the multi-million-dollar ones. Those usually take several weeks to months of negotiation. And it's an ongoing and continuing relationship with NASA for all of those spending. I think the GeoCard people have calls like 2 or 3 times a week, don't they? I don't know if you know them, no. So I'm pretty sure it's like at least weekly. If you have a special contract, there's usually a higher level of paperwork that's required. And sometimes they will set what they call no-go, no-go points at different points. So they may have you do milestones, and if you're not at a certain milestone by a certain date, they'll have a meeting with you and they'll decide if they're going to give you an extension to meet that goal, or if things aren't looking promising and they need to cease spending because they don't want to throw good money after bad. And so it's possible you may get $1 million award in your first year, and if you have several milestones, they may pull the money back if you don't meet those milestones and you're not talking with them. They have what they call earned value management training, depending on how large your award is, that they may require you to attend. They also have a special grants management system that you may have to have a project director if it's a very large proposal that gets trained in this system. NASA has a ton of blogs. So if you haven't looked around in the funding for the areas that you're interested in, you might look at and see what types of information are out there. Blogs and webcasts and newsletters and things like that. If you've never reviewed for NASA, volunteer to be a reviewer. Not only does this help you meet the program officer, but it also kind of puts you, if he's looking for reviewers and you help him out by being a reviewer, it kind of gives you a good start for the relationship with him. The STEM areas for NASA are always looking for reviewers too, so that's a good way to get started too. So is there anything that I covered that you have questions about? No? It's a lot. It's a lot.
Oh, I have one here. Can postdocs be listed as co-PIs in NASA?
Yes.
Yes, they are. And also, I have a question about CVs. Are CVs only for PIs or for personnel as well? How about a TBD?
A TBD. Oh, to be. So if you have a person, you haven't picked who it's going to be, then usually there's a section for personnel qualifications where you list the people and you talk about their qualifications. So if you've got someone that you haven't figured out who that person is, that's where you want to talk about the qualifications for the type of person that you're looking for. On the CVs, it varies so much by solicitation that you just have to look to see. It's very common that they'll all fall under the 10% limitation. And so you have to take the effort chart that you're going to create, figure out who has how much effort that they're going to expend on the proposal, and then from that chart determine who you need CVs from and what length the CV has to be. So like your primary person may have a 2-page CV and the other co-PIs may just have a 1-page CV. Any other questions?
This is a more broad question than just NASA, but there had been sort of a rumor that there was going to be a convergence of BioSketch CV, whatever you call, among federal research funding agencies, or perhaps a subset of them, so that we would spend less time preparing those.
So right now, so the question is that there had been some rumors that there was going to be a convergence of like a common BioSketch format or repository for all the federal agencies. Eventually they may get there, but it'll be a slow process.
Okay.
Right now, NIH is, they prefer the science CV. And so they have pushed that for several years, although they haven't required it on submissions. This past year, NSF announced that when 20-1 came out, they were going to follow the Science CV format. So you would have to register in Science CV, build your BioSketch for NSF in the Science CV template. And there's something that's hidden in the code so that when you upload the PDF that came from Science CV, they will know at NSF that you use Science CV to generate that PDF. What we don't know, and we never could get a straight answer from them, was if it wasn't generated from Science CV, would it be accepted or not? The information that we got was that there would be another accepted format information come out when 20-1 became effective. that would tell you the alternate procedures that would be allowed. But we kind of got the feeling that those were only supposed to be used if there was something going on and you couldn't get the science CV biosketch generator.